The scent of lilies was suffocating. It was a sweet, heavy, funeral perfume that clung to the dark wood of the pews and the black fabric of Clara's dress. She sat in the front row, a black veil obscuring her face, a fragile barrier against the pitying, sympathetic glances of the 200 people who had come to mourn her husband. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her posture a rigid, perfect portrait of a grieving but dignified widow. Inside, she was just numb, a hollowed-out cavern where a vibrant, happy life had been just 4 days ago. Mark was gone. The word was a simple, brutal fact that her mind refused to process. One moment, he was kissing her goodbye, his hand lingering on her waist, on his way to a routine client meeting. The next, she was getting a call from a state trooper about a multi-car pileup on the interstate. A freak accident, instant, painless, they had assured her, a small, cold comfort. From the pulpit, Mark's best friend and business partner, David, was delivering a eulogy, his voice thick with a grief that mirrored her own. Mark was a man who built things, David said, his gaze finding Clara's through the veil. He built a business, he built a life, he built a home. And at the center of it all was his partnership with Clara. They were a team in every sense of the word. The words sent a tremor through her, and a memory, sharp and vivid, bloomed in the funeral's somber gray. It was 12 years ago. The two of them, young and broke and deliriously in love, standing in the empty, dusty shell of what would become the Gilded Spoon. They were both covered in pale green paint, laughing as Mark smudged a streak of it on her nose. "You really think this will work?" she had asked, her heart a flutter of hope and terror. "Clara," he had said, taking her flour-dusted hands in his, "your recipes are magic. My business sense is adequate." He had grinned his easy, confident grin. "Together, we're unstoppable. This place isn't just a bakery, my love. It's our future." And it had been. She had poured her heart and soul into the craft, her passion for creating perfect, comforting pastries the engine of their success. He handled the business side, the numbers and negotiations that made her head spin, and their shared dream, the Gilded Spoon, had become the most beloved bakery in the city. Her sacrifice, giving up her own ambitions of a full-scale cafe and culinary school to pour the profits back into his higher-yield consulting work, had been for them, for their future. A soft sob from her mother-in-law, Joan, brought her back to the present. She reached out and squeezed the older woman's hand. They were united in their loss, a family shattered. During a quiet moment, as a string quartet played a somber melody, Clara's gaze drifted to the back of the crowded chapel. A woman she didn't recognize was standing alone near the heavy oak doors, separate from the clusters of mourners. She was tall and elegant, and very, very pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. A wave of sympathy passed through Clara. A pregnant woman, all alone at a funeral. It was a sad, lonely sight. The woman's eyes, full of a pain that looked unnervingly familiar, met hers for a fleeting second before Clara turned her attention back to the front. The reception at their home was a surreal, muted affair. The house, usually so full of the warm, buttery scent of baking, was filled with the funereal smell of lilies and catered food. Friends and family moved through the familiar rooms, their voices a low, sympathetic hum. Clara played the role of the gracious, heartbroken widow, accepting condolences, sharing memories, her movements slow and dreamlike. Mark's parents, Joan and Richard, clung to her, the three of them a small, broken island in a sea of mourners. "He loved you so much, Clara," Joan whispered, her eyes red-rimmed. "You were the best thing that ever happened to him." "You were his rock," Richard added, his voice thick. "The bakery, it was his pride and joy because it was yours." Their words were a comfort, a validation of the life, the partnership she had believed in so completely. She was in the kitchen, taking a moment to breathe, her back pressed against the cool steel of her industrial-grade refrigerator, when the woman from the back of the chapel appeared in the doorway. Up close, she was even more striking, with wide, tear-filled green eyes and a cascade of dark, curly hair. Her pregnancy was not a gentle curve, but a pronounced, heavy roundedness. She was due soon. "I'm so sorry," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "I know this is a terrible time. I shouldn't be here." "It's all right," Clara said, her voice soft with a practiced hostess's grace. "I'm sorry. Have we met? Were you a colleague of Mark's?" The woman shook her head, a single, perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. "No," she said. "My name is Isabel." She took a small, shaky step into the kitchen, her hand never leaving her stomach. He never told you about me, or about us." A cold, unpleasant feeling began to creep up Clara's spine. "Us?" Isabel's gaze dropped to the floor, her voice a barely audible whisper. "I'm so sorry to do this now. I didn't know who else to tell. I didn't know where else to go." She finally lifted her head, her green eyes locking onto Clara's, and delivered the words that would shatter Clara's world into a million irreparable pieces. "I'm carrying Mark's son." The sounds of the reception outside the kitchen door, the polite murmur of conversation, the clinking of wine glasses, a distant laugh, all of it seemed to fade into a dull, rushing roar. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, and Clara's entire reality narrowed to a single, horrifying focal point: the stranger's swollen belly. Mark? My Mark? The man I built a life with? The man whose body is not even cold in the ground? It was a lie. A cruel, insane, opportunistic lie. It had to be. But then she looked into Isabel's eyes, and she saw not the cunning of a con artist, but the same profound, soul-deep grief that she saw in her own mirror every morning. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The perfect life she had, the man she loved, the future she had sacrificed for, all of it was a lie. The silent burden she had so willingly carried, the belief that her sacrifices were for their shared dream, had been a sham. She had not been a partner. She had been a resource, the quiet, reliable engine funding a secret, second life. And the proof was standing right in front of her, a living, breathing, and devastatingly pregnant testament to her husband's betrayal. The world in Clara's kitchen narrowed to a single horrifying point: the taut, rounded swell of Isabel's stomach beneath her black dress. The polite, sympathetic hum of the reception in the next room faded into a distant, mocking roar. It was her mother-in-law, Joan, who broke the spell. She bustled into the kitchen, a look of concern on her face. "Clara, dear, are you all right? You've been in here for—" She stopped short, her eyes falling on Isabel. Her expression of soft concern instantly hardened into one of cold, aristocratic fury. "Who are you?" Joan demanded, her voice a low, sharp command. "What are you doing in my son's house?" "Joan, please," Richard, her father-in-law, said, appearing behind his wife. He, too, took in the scene: Clara's ashen face, the strange, weeping, pregnant woman, and his posture stiffened. "This is a private gathering for family. I think you should leave." "I tried to leave," Isabel whispered, tears streaming down her face. I needed her to know. I needed to tell her." "Tell her what?" Joan snapped. "What possible business could you have with my son's wife on the day of his funeral?" Isabel looked at Clara, her eyes pleading for an intervention that Clara was incapable of giving. She took a shaky breath and spoke the words again, this time to the hostile, unyielding faces of her dead lover's parents. "I'm carrying Mark's baby, his son." The reaction was explosive. "That is a disgusting lie," Richard snarled, taking a protective step in front of Clara. "You are a sick, opportunistic vulture trying to take advantage of a grieving family. Get out of this house before I call the police." "It's not a lie," Isabel cried, her voice cracking with a pain that was undeniably real. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I loved him. He told me he was going to leave her. He told me he wanted to build a life with me, with our son." She fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking. He took out a life insurance policy for us, for me and the baby, to make sure we would be taken care of if anything ever happened to him. It's all in my name." The words, life insurance policy, landed in the tense, furious silence of the kitchen with the force of a physical blow. It was proof. It was a detail too specific, too verifiable to be a lie. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, opening a door to a secret world Clara never knew existed. And it was the moment her in-laws abandoned her. The change was breathtaking. The anger on Joan's face did not soften. It shifted, refocused. The hard, protective glare she had aimed at Isabel now turned with a new, calculating coldness toward Clara. Richard's posture, which had been a bulldog's defense of his daughter-in-law, deflated, replaced by a look of stunned, grim contemplation. Their son's legacy had just, in an instant, been rewritten. It was no longer the business he had built with his wife. It was the child he had created with his mistress. Their grief for their lost son was instantly channeled into a new, fierce, and proprietary purpose: their grandchild. Joan took a step toward Isabel, her movements now slow and deliberate. "A boy?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling whisper. Isabel, confused by the sudden shift, could only nod. Joan's gaze dropped to Isabel's stomach, her expression a complex mixture of horror, grief, and a dawning, possessive wonder. She looked at Clara, and in her eyes, Clara saw the end of their relationship. She was no longer the beloved daughter-in-law, the grieving widow to be comforted and protected. She was now the barren wife, the obstacle standing between them and their son's only heir. This was the last straw. The meeting a week later was a cold, formal execution. Clara was summoned to her in-laws' house, a place where she had celebrated a dozen family Christmases, a place that had always felt like a second home. Now it felt like a hostile boardroom. Isabel was already there, seated on the sofa, a teacup trembling in her hands. She looked pale and nervous, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Joan was sitting beside her, a protective hand resting on her arm. Richard stood by the fireplace, the stern patriarch presiding over a grim but necessary piece of family business. "Clara, thank you for coming," Richard began, his tone devoid of all warmth. "We have all had a week to process this tragic and complicated situation. It has become clear that Mark had responsibilities and made promises that you were not aware of. The most important thing now," Joan added, her voice a blade of cold maternal steel, "is the welfare of Mark's son, Mark's only child, his legacy." Clara sat in a stiff armchair opposite them, a profound, chilling sense of unreality washing over her. "We have spoken with our lawyers," Richard continued, "and we have come to a solution that we feel is the most fair and equitable for everyone involved, especially for the innocent child." He laid out their demand with the dispassionate air of a CEO announcing a corporate restructuring. The house, which he now referred to as Mark's primary real estate asset, was to be sold immediately. The Gilded Spoon, which he called Mark's business, was also to be put on the market. The proceeds from these sales, he concluded, will be placed into a professionally managed trust. It will provide for Isabel's living expenses and ensure that Mark's son has everything he needs for his future, his schooling, his university education, everything. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it stole the air from Clara's lungs. They were proposing to liquidate her entire life, her home, her life's work, to fund the future of her husband's illegitimate child. Joan delivered the final, cruel, and unforgivable blow. "You are a very talented baker, Clara," she said, her voice laced with a condescending pity. "It's a wonderful hobby, and you are very good at it. But we all know that Mark was the real business genius behind the Gilded Spoon. He made it the success it is. It is only right that his legacy, his hard work, goes to his son." They had not just abandoned her, they had erased her. 12 years of her creativity, her recipes, her 16-hour days, all of it was being rewritten as a hobby, a footnote in the grand story of their brilliant martyred son. She didn't remember the drive home. She found herself standing in the middle of her dark, empty bakery long after closing time. The sweet, familiar scent of sugar and yeast was the only thing that felt real in a world that had become a nightmare. Her staff, her real family, had cleaned up and gone home, leaving a pot of chamomile tea for her in her small office. She stood there, surrounded by the beautiful, successful business she had built, and she felt a rage so pure and so cold it burned away the last vestiges of her grief. The man she had been mourning was a fraud. The in-laws she had loved had become her enemies. She was not a widow. She was a target. She walked into her small office, the heart of her empire, and looked at her own reflection in the dark window. The heartbroken, grief-stricken woman from the funeral was gone. In her place was a woman who had been betrayed, a woman who was being threatened, a woman whose entire life was about to be stolen from her. She picked up the phone and dialed the number of a lawyer a friend had recommended years ago, a woman known for being the sharpest, most tenacious family law attorney in the city. When the receptionist at the other end answered, Clara's voice was perfectly steady, hard as stone, and ready for war. "Yes," she said, "I'd like to make an appointment with Ava Chen. It's regarding an estate dispute." The months that followed the transfer of funds were a long, quiet exercise in self-delusion. Ethan told himself that his sacrifice had been a necessary evil, a painful but noble act to protect his family. He threw himself into his work, the familiar, back-breaking labor of the orchard a welcome distraction from the hollow ache where his dream used to be. He pruned the apple trees with a savage intensity, hauled crates of fruit until his muscles screamed, and spent his nights trying to figure out how he could possibly manage the upcoming bottling season with his old, inefficient equipment. The $25,000 was a ghost that haunted his every financial decision. It was the new tractor tire he couldn't afford, the part-time help he couldn't hire, the constant, grinding stress of operating on a razor-thin margin. From his family, there was only a profound and unnerving silence on the matter. The few times he saw them, the conversation was all breezy, superficial chatter. They spoke of the weather, of a neighbor's new fence, of Leo's brilliant new ideas for disrupting the market. The massive, life-altering sacrifice he had made for them had been completely, surgically removed from the family history. It was as if it had never happened. He was the silent, burdened one, and they were the masters of a comfortable, convenient amnesia. The fragmentation began on a crisp Saturday in late autumn. Ethan was in town, making a cider delivery to Chloe's restaurant, the Gilded Spoon. He was maneuvering his old, slightly rusted pickup truck into a parking space when a low, guttural roar made him look up. A sports car, a machine so sleek, black, and aggressively expensive it looked like it had landed from another planet, snarled down the small town's quiet main street. It pulled into a space directly in front of the town's most expensive bistro. The driver's side door opened, and his brother, Leo, unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He was wearing a pair of designer sunglasses and a smug, self-satisfied grin. The sight was a physical blow. It was a visceral, public flaunting of the life Leo was living versus the one Ethan was enduring. Ethan, in his mud-caked boots and worn flannel shirt, felt a hot, unfamiliar surge of pure, unadulterated rage. His sacrificed dream, his new bottling line, his entire future. It had been reincarnated as this ridiculous, phallic monument to his brother's irresponsibility. He got out of his truck and walked across the street, his footsteps heavy. Leo. His brother turned, his grin faltering for a split second when he saw the look on Ethan's face. "Hey, bro," he said, recovering his swagger. "What's up? Checking out the new ride?" "Where did you get the money for this, Leo?" Ethan asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Leo laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Made a couple of smart trades. The market's volatile. You gotta know when to get in and get out. I'm back in the game, Ethan. You should be happy for me." "Happy for you?" Ethan's voice was tight. "I gave up my entire savings so you wouldn't have your legs broken by a loan shark, and you used it to buy a car?" "Whoa, hold on," Leo said, putting up his hands. "That money was a family thing. That's over. This," he said, patting the hood of the car, "is my fresh start. You can't expect me to stay down forever, can you?" There was no remorse, no guilt, no acknowledgement of the debt, moral or otherwise. Just the same breathtaking golden child entitlement he had displayed his entire life. Ethan drove to his parents' house in a cold fury. He walked in without knocking. They were in the living room, watching television. "He bought a sports car," Ethan said, his voice shaking with a rage he could no longer contain. "He's driving it around town like a king, and you haven't paid me back a single dollar." His parents looked up, their expressions not of shame, but of annoyance at being confronted. "Ethan, for heaven's sake, keep your voice down," his mother said, a look of pained exasperation on her face. "Your brother is finally getting his confidence back. He needs to look successful to be successful. You, of all people, should understand that." "I understand that he's spending my future on a new toy," Ethan shot back. "It wasn't a toy, it was a family crisis," his father said, his voice firm with a self-righteous authority. "We dealt with it. It's time to move on." "Move on?" Ethan asked, his voice incredulous. "What about the loan? What about paying me back?" His mother stood up, her face a mask of wounded indignation. "How can you be so petty?" she asked, her voice rising. "After all we've been through, your brother is starting a new venture. He needs every penny he has to get back on his feet. You can't expect us to pay you back now. Are you trying to ruin your own brother over money?" There it was, the final, brutal, and explicit betrayal. They had no intention of ever repaying him. They didn't see it as a loan to be honored. They saw it as a tax, a duty he had paid for the privilege of being the responsible son. The brotherhood he had sacrificed his dream to protect had been a lie all along. It was a one-way street of obligation, and he had just reached the dead end. The fragmentation was complete. Later that night, Ethan sat at the small, worn bar of the Gilded Spoon, staring into a glass of his own cider. The golden, bubbly liquid, usually a source of such pride, seemed to mock him. Chloe was wiping down the counter, her expression one of deep concern. He told her everything: the promise of the loan, the sacrifice of his dream, the new sports car, and the final brutal conversation at his parents' house. "It's gone, Chloe," he said, his voice a hollow whisper. "The money, my dream, my family, it was all a lie." Chloe stopped wiping the bar. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective loyalty that he had not seen from his own family in years. "A lie? Ethan, you are the most honest, hard-working person I know. You saved them, and they're spitting in your face?" She paused, her gaze sharpening. "Wait a minute. You were so worried back then, after it happened. Did you ever, Did you do what we talked about? Did you get anything in writing?" Her words were a spark in the desolate, empty darkness of his mind. The visit to Mr. Harris, the old man's quiet, practical wisdom, the trip to the notary, the document, the heavy, official-feeling paper he had locked away in the bottom drawer of his desk, the promissory note. A new, strange energy began to course through him. The despair, so absolute just moments before, began to recede, burned away by the heat of a memory he had tried to forget. He hadn't been a complete fool. In his moment of greatest weakness, he had listened to a wise old man and had forged for himself a small, secret shield. He looked up at Chloe, and the defeated, heartbroken look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a new, cold, and dangerous light. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did." He stood up from the bar, the hollow ache in his chest now filling with something else, a cold, quiet, and unshakable anger. He was no longer the dutiful son, the sacrificial brother. He had been a creditor all along. He walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air. His shoulders were straight, his stride was purposeful. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a raw, open wound. But now it was being forged into something else, something hard and sharp and strong. He was on his way home to unlock the drawer that held the key to either his family's accountability or their ruin. The winter that followed was a season of quiet, deliberate reconstruction. The fiery rage Ethan had felt after the final confrontation at his parents' house did not burn out. Instead, it cooled and hardened into a core of pure, unshakable resolve. The emotional ties to his family, frayed for years, had finally been severed. He was no longer a son and a brother, waiting for a repayment that would never come. He was a businessman who had made a bad loan, and he was now in the process of rectifying that mistake. He did not call them. He did not engage. He poured his energy, his anger, and his profound sense of betrayal into the one thing that had never let him down, his work. The orchard, dormant and sleeping under a blanket of snow, became his silent confidant. He spent the cold months in his cidery, not just maintaining his old, struggling equipment, but innovating. He experimented with new yeast strains and fermentation techniques, creating small, experimental batches of cider that were more complex and nuanced than anything he had ever made before. It was a kind of therapy, a way of creating something beautiful and true out of a season of bitterness and loss. He also began, for the first time in years, to rebuild his life outside the orchard. He reconnected with his chosen family. He had weekly dinners with Chloe at her restaurant, their conversation a comfortable mix of business and friendship. He spent time with Mr. Harris, absorbing the old man's quiet, practical wisdom, a welcome antidote to the chaotic, emotional logic of his own family. He started attending the local Growers Association meetings again, re-engaging with a community of peers who respected his skill and valued his contribution. He was slowly, methodically, building a fortress of support around himself. The promissory note, the legally binding document he had retrieved from his desk, sat in a safe deposit box at the local bank. It was a silent, powerful presence in his life, a trump card he was not yet ready to play. He was giving them a chance, a long, silent season to do the right thing. They did not. The few phone calls he received from his mother were masterpieces of willful ignorance, filled with breezy chatter about her garden club and complaints about his father's snoring. The $25,000, the sports car, the broken brotherhood, it was all an unspoken, forbidden topic. They had moved on. They expected him to do the same.
As the first buds of spring began to appear on the apple trees, Ethan knew it was time. He could not build a new future for his business while the unresolved debt of his past was holding him back. He met with a local lawyer, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, whom Chloe had recommended. He laid the whole story out on her desk, the family dynamic, the debt, the sacrifice, and finally, the signed and notarized promissory note. Sarah read the document carefully, her expression grim. "This is ironclad, Ethan," she said, looking up at him. "It's a formal loan, secured by their property. They signed it. They owe you the money." She leaned forward. "So what do you want to do?" "I want what I'm owed," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "I want my dream back." "Okay, then," she said, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "The first step is a formal letter of demand. We will officially notify them that the loan is in default and give them 30 days to contact this office and establish a repayment plan. It's a warning shot. Let's see how they react." The family's reaction was as swift as it was explosive. The letter, a cold legal document that could not be ignored or emotionally manipulated, shattered their comfortable amnesia. His mother was the first to call, her voice a torrent of tears and wounded accusations. "Ethan, how could you do this?" she wailed. "A lawyer? You're sending a lawyer after your own mother and father? You're threatening to take our home? After everything we've done for you? You are breaking my heart. Do you hear me? You are breaking it." The old Ethan would have been gutted by her tears, his resolve dissolving under the heat of her guilt. But the new Ethan, the man who had spent a long, cold winter forging a new spine, was unmoved. "This is a legal matter now, Mom. Please direct all future communication to my lawyer." He hung up the phone, his heart pounding, but his hand perfectly still. He then blocked her number. It was a small, digital act, but it felt like a wall being raised, a boundary being firmly and finally set. His father's texts began a few hours later, a barrage of short, sharp attacks on his honor. "You have brought disgrace and shame on this family. Your brother is trying to rebuild his life and you do this to him? This is not how a son behaves. We are deeply disappointed." Ethan read each one, a familiar, dull ache in his chest. He screenshotted the entire conversation, forwarded it to Sarah with the subject line, "For your records," and then blocked his father's number. The threats, the tears, the guilt, it was all just noise now. He was done listening.
The 30-day period passed in a state of tense radio silence. Ethan continued his work, the rhythm of the orchard a soothing counterpoint to the distant war he had initiated. He was in the cidery, testing the pH of a new experimental batch of Perry, a symbol of his determination to move forward, when his phone rang. It was Sarah. "Well, we have their official response," she said, her voice grim. "Or rather, their lack of one. The deadline was yesterday. They haven't made contact." She paused. "But I did get a call this morning from a lawyer they've retained, a real shark from the city." Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. And, Sarah said, her voice laced with the lawyer's weary disdain, "their official position is that the promissory note was signed under extreme emotional duress and is therefore invalid. They are formally refusing to pay. They are calling your bluff, Ethan." He stood there in the quiet of his cidery, the scent of fermenting pears hanging in the air. He looked at his old, struggling equipment, at the dream that was still just out of reach. The distant war was over. They had made their move. The only path left was the final, direct confrontation. A confrontation where he would be forced to lay down his final, devastating card, the threat of taking their home. The stage was set for the final act. Deliver this with the warm, polished, and confident tone of a professional female storyteller, similar to a host on an NPR or narrative podcast. The pacing must be fluid and conversational, not slow. Use natural, engaging intonation to tell the story effectively while avoiding any theatrical drama. The final meeting was Ethan's idea. Sarah, his lawyer, had advised him that the next logical step was to file the lien and begin the cold, impersonal legal process of foreclosure. But Ethan knew he needed to close this chapter face to face. It was not for them. It was for him. He needed to stand in that living room, not as the dutiful son, but as a man in his own right, and speak the truth of what had been broken. He had Sarah arrange one last meeting at his parents' home. He arrived at precisely 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. He was not the same man who had left this house in a cold fury months ago. He was calm, his posture was confident, and he carried a single, slim manila folder. The prodigal son had returned, not to beg, but to collect. They were waiting for him, a united front of angry defiance. His mother, his father, and Leo were all seated in the living room, the same room where the crisis had begun. They had clearly prepared, their expressions a mixture of self-righteous anger and contempt. They were expecting a negotiation, a final, emotional plea they could dismantle. "Well, look who it is," Leo sneered from the armchair. "Decided to come crawling back, did you?" "We are not going to be bullied, Ethan," his mother said, her voice sharp. "We spoke to our lawyer. That little piece of paper you tricked us into signing won't hold up in any court." He didn't engage with their emotional attacks. He walked to the coffee table and placed his folder on its polished surface. He looked at each of them, his gaze steady and clear. "I'm not here to argue," he said, his voice so calm it was unnerving. "I'm here for a final accounting." He opened his folder and placed a copy of the signed, notarized promissory note on the table in front of them. "This is not a piece of paper. This is a legal contract. A year ago, to solve a problem that you created," he glanced at Leo, "I gave this family $25,000. It was my entire savings. It was my future of my business. It was my dream." He looked at his parents. "In return for that sacrifice, you signed this document. You promised to repay the loan, and you secured that promise with this house. For a year, you have not only refused to honor that contract, you have acted as if it never existed." "It was a family crisis," his father blustered, his face turning red. "You're our son. It was your duty. And now you're threatening your own parents? Trying to make us homeless? What kind of monster have you become?" The old accusations, the familiar levers of guilt and duty, no longer had any effect. He was immune. He let their storm of emotion break against the wall of his quiet, unshakable truth. When their tirade finally sputtered out into a fuming silence, he delivered his ultimatum.
"Here are your 2 options," he said, his voice like ice. "They are the only options. Option 1. My lawyer has drawn up a 5-year repayment plan. It's all here." He slid a second document from the folder. "You will sign it today, in front of the notary I have waiting in my truck outside, and you will begin making payments on the 1st of next month. The agreement is non-negotiable." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Option 2, he said, his voice dropping to a low, final tone, "is that I will walk out of this house, call my lawyer, and instruct her to begin foreclosure proceedings immediately. The case is ironclad, and you will lose. You will lose the house, you will be responsible for all legal fees, and your credit will be ruined for a decade." He stood back. "The choice is yours. You have 5 minutes to decide." The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He watched them. He saw the fury in their eyes war with the cold, terrified realization that this was not a bluff. The emotional power they had held over him his entire life was gone, and in its place was a simple, brutal business transaction. They looked at each other, a silent, frantic conversation passing between them. They were trapped, not by his cruelty, but by the consequences of their own actions. Finally, defeated, his father reached for a pen. He wouldn't look at Ethan as he signed the repayment agreement, his signature a ragged, angry scrawl. His mother followed, her hand shaking with a silent, impotent rage. Leo, his face a mask of pure hatred, stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Ethan took his copy of the signed and notarized agreement. He looked at his parents, no longer with anger, but with a kind of sad finality. "Goodbye," he said. He walked out the front door and did not look back. The brotherhood was over. The family, as he had known it, was a ghost. Epilogue. 1 year later. The cidery at Orchard End was humming. It was the sound of a dream, finally fully realized. In the center of the newly expanded barn, the gleaming stainless steel pressing and bottling line ran with a smooth, efficient rhythm, filling dozens of green glass bottles with the crisp, golden cider that had just won a gold medal at the State Agricultural Fair. A year had passed. The monthly payments from his parents had arrived on the first of every month, a cold electronic transfer that was the only communication he'd had with them. Ethan had combined that money with a small business loan and had finally bought the equipment that had been the subject of his dreams. His business was thriving. The brotherhood was gone, but in its place, a cold, clean, and legal peace existed. He had lost a family, but he had gained himself. He was labeling a case of his newest creation, a dry, sparkling cider he had named the Promissory, when Chloe and Mr. Harris walked in, carrying a celebratory pizza. "To the gold medal winner!" Chloe cheered, raising an imaginary glass. Mr. Harris looked around the new facility, at the humming machinery and the pallets of neatly stacked cases, a look of deep paternal pride in his eyes. "You did it, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You built it right." Ethan looked at his two friends, at their warm, genuine smiles. He looked at the business he had built, and then saved, and then built again, stronger than before. He picked up one of the freshly labeled bottles, the glass cool and solid in his hand. The liquid inside was clear and bright. He was at peace, he was successful, and he was, finally and completely, free.